In Matthew 10:22, Jesus says, "The one who endures to the end will be saved." And if you don't understand the surrounding context of persecution, the coming of Jesus, and the house of God, then there's a chance you'll misunderstand Jesus' words entirely. To be fully honest and transparent, I am not 100% certain about what Jesus means here, nor is there a consensus among biblical scholars. And I'll explain why that is. But in this video, we're going to do our best to make sense of what Jesus really means here. And in order to do that, we need to establish 8 key ideas along the way. Otherwise, we'll just be really confused. Let's jump into Matthew chapter 10 and walk through each of these key details. Welcome to Above Reproach Ministries. I'm Jason Camacho. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse 22. We'll get to verse 25. If this content blesses you, do me a favor. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. And then let me know in the comments what really stood out to you, what you learned, that kind of thing. And then watch the rest of our Matthew teaching series if you have not already. For those of you who don't want to stick around all the way to the end, even though this is only 3 verses, Jesus is making a statement about the faith and the future of his disciples. So Jesus goes on talking to his disciples as he's sending them out to the surrounding towns and villages of Israel. He says, "You will be hated by all for my name's sake." So we already see a repeated warning as we get to this next part. But the one who endures what? Endures when? He says, endures to the end. They will be saved. So many questions we have to ask. Here's the first observation in the text. In Matthew chapter 24, we see this very same warning repeated. So whatever time and event Jesus is likely referencing here must be the same one he references in Matthew chapter 24, verse 12 through 14, with this same language that he's using. He says, people's love grows cold. He says, endure to the end, to be saved. He says, this gospel will be proclaimed throughout the whole world. And lest we forget, here's something we don't often think about. Jesus is only speaking to the 12 apostles here. That doesn't mean nothing in this is for us, but no one else is present. We see this in verse 5. And because of this, the audience context will have a massive influence on how we interpret these words for our own lives. This doesn't mean, again, that none of this is for us. But I will say, this is at least directly for the 12 apostles when they're sent out. And this isn't even regarding the immediate future for them. It's regarding later in the future, when we see a lot of this transpire in the book of Acts. So after the Great Commission and the day of Pentecost, either way, I do believe there are underlying wisdom principles for us here, even though it's not directly to us. But we already saw some seasonal instructions earlier in verse 5 through 15. So if that's the case, then possibly much of this, if not all of this, is for a specific group in a specific season of human history. And again, there might be some stuff underlying wisdom for us, for all God's people across time, but that I think we're going to see that Jesus might not be making a general statement about faith and endurance for all God's people across all human history, but rather he's speaking of a very specific situation his apostles are being sent into, that they're going to see in their lifetime. So much of what we're going to see Jesus describe and instruct about, it's not going to happen in their immediate future. It's going to happen after the resurrection. So just to make that observation, that's really important. We should be asking, who is being saved, number one? Who are the people being saved? What is it that these people are enduring, right? And then another thing to consider is it says they need to endure to the end. The end of what? Right? So I'm going to tackle each of these. Here's the second observation. Who is being saved here? Well, it's pretty clearly those who endure to the end of something. These are believing ones, those who have faith or trust. They at least take Jesus at his word and respond accordingly. And then the third observation is enduring what? At least the persecution and suffering and the violence that the disciples are going to suffer at the hands of unbelievers and the wolves Jesus has described. This all comes against his people. And then we should, again, be answering, well, the end of what? And I think this is either the end of their lives, right? Just a general statement about if you continue believing in Jesus to the end of your life, or Jesus has in mind some appointed time. When we get to Matthew 24, I think this will become much more clear because Jesus adds more details than he does at this point in his ministry for a reason. But it seems likely what's in view is the end of the age. This seems to be, these people seem to be those who will see the end of the temple, see the end of the old covenant in their lifetime, see the end of that age. According to the next verse, in verse 23, we're going to see enduring actually involves fleeing. It's not just taking the blows mindlessly and like standing your ground all the time, but sometimes it's moving on and continuing in faith in the mission of Jesus in the next city, in the next town. And then we should be asking again, what are they being saved from? What does it mean that they will be saved? Is this spiritual eternal salvation? Here's the fifth observation. Being saved, for the most part in the Old Testament, has more to do with being saved from temporary physical danger and physical death. That doesn't mean the idea of salvation is never spiritual, never eternal, but elsewhere in Scripture we have much of salvation language used of temporary salvation from death and danger, while elsewhere it can refer to spiritual salvation eternally. So it can mean either of these things depending on the context. To be consistent with what Jesus has been saying, in my opinion, this has to at least involve the judgment that's coming upon the nation of Israel because of their unbelief and rejection of Jesus and his kingdom. Jesus just said in verse 15, it's going to be worse on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so there's, or rather for the people that reject Jesus than for Sodom and Gomorrah. So the justice, the judgment, the wrath coming upon the people of Israel and those cities and towns and villages and families that rejected Jesus, that's going to be physical death. And it's not just that they suffer physical death, but that's at least what's in view. It seems to be something that Jesus will enable his apostles to avoid somehow, and that comes by enduring through the trials and the suffering they face. So if he's talking spiritual salvation right here, he's talking about eternally in the presence of God, true, genuine, salvific faith, that's what he has in mind. I agree that genuine salvific faith is always going to be enduring by nature, okay? But I think this at least is continuing to hold on to Jesus' words through the suffering, through the persecution that he's added, or he's described. So here's what I think is happening so far. We read verse 23, it'll get clearer. When they persecute you in one town, hey, run to the next. And you're like, cowards? No, strategic. Wise, shrewd as serpents. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So the Son of Man coming seems to be connected to the end he has in view here. Here's what I think is happening. It seems like the judgment and the wrath coming upon these towns and villages and really the nation that rejected Jesus, rejected the terms of peace, like that's coming. This is what comes through the Jewish wars and culminates in the year AD 70 with the Roman armies destroying Jerusalem, destroying the temple. And if you're not familiar with that historical event or that history, read the writings of Josephus. But people who believe Jesus about the wrath he's warning them about, if they really believe, they'll flee when the time comes, when they see the signs. And therefore, having endured all the stuff he's described, they'll escape with their lives. So we can at least say being saved here is conditioned upon enduring. What that is, though, seems a bit unclear to me. So we have two options. Option number one, either Jesus is saying, endure through all of this, and you will be saved and enter the kingdom, and that endurance through persecution becomes a requirement for salvation or a condition for entering the kingdom of God. That's one option. The second view is Jesus is saying, those of his people who safely make it through all the stuff he's described, and they make it to the time when they see the end come upon Jerusalem and the temple and the old covenant system, when they see all that, by following his instructions to leave Jerusalem, when they see these signs, their physical lives will be saved. And we know that in Hebrews, the old covenant, the old system, is referred to as fading. It's growing old. It's ready to vanish away. And that doesn't violate Matthew 5:17. But I think that is at least the end Jesus has in view, having endured and made it to the end of that era, which involved the peak of Christian persecution. They're going to find God's protection outside Jerusalem, where it feels safe and seems safe, and the prideful that rejected Jesus ignore his warnings and presume upon their ethnic descent from Abraham. Yeah, they're actually in danger. But for those believers that actually take his word at face value, they'll leave and they'll have their physical lives saved. For those believers that didn't endure through all of that, and they actually died along the way, maybe they died at the hands of persecutors, or they died at the hands of Nero, or they died in some way along the way before the end comes. If they die, they still have eternal life. But I think either this enduring right here is up to the person, right? And it's referring to them continuing in the faith, or this enduring to the end is speaking of if a person makes it this far, if they last this long, if they're still alive through all of that persecution and suffering and violence, that seems to be God's choice, by the way, then we'll see what Hosea says. Or rather, we're going to see what is similar to what Hosea says. Hosea in his prophecy says, the righteous will live by faith. Their lives will be saved. They'll be spared. Those who obey Jesus' words in a similar way, having endured all that stuff and made it to the end, like they'll have their lives spared if they do what he says, which presumably, if they're believers, they'll heed his warning and act in faithfulness and leave Judea and Jerusalem. Hey, did you know that this entire ministry runs off the support of people like you? All of our free resources, teachings, and classes are made possible by viewers like you. So if you believe in what God is doing through this ministry and you want to help us in our mission, please consider partnering with us financially. You can give a one-time gift or become a monthly partner on our website. Our mission is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. And when you become a monthly supporter, you get access to exclusive content, special resources, and other perks coming soon. Visit abovereproachministry.com/donate to give however the Lord leads you. We have many other projects that we're working on that need to be funded. A mobile app for all of our courses and teachings, and other Bible courses that are in the works right now. So thank you so much for all your support and prayers. Let's get back to the video. So here's the sixth observation. There's a final cycle. This is what we see all throughout the Old Testament. This time of Jesus and the generation of his day, this just seems to be the next phase in God's redemptive story. But the cycle's repeating all over again. God's providing safe spaces again. There's a new exodus Jesus is bringing. There's a new final plague coming upon the land of swords. And this safe space is not a house with blood on the doors from a lamb, but it's taking refuge in Jesus through faith to be part of his house. And you're like, well, what do you mean his house? He's about to describe his household and Jesus being the master of the house. That's what he refers to himself as. But again, the condition seems to be enduring, whether it be spiritual salvation or being physically saved from the wrath of God coming on that generation. Like whatever view you take, there are cities of refuge almost that are being provided. Look at what he says. When they persecute you in one town, go to the next. It's almost reminiscent of the cities of refuge, right? This is the sixth observation. In the Old Testament, we see the cities of refuge appointed for people who accidentally killed someone, and they can flee to that place to escape the vengeance or the wrath of the avenger. God is providing another city for his people to flee to here, and it's not that they've accidentally murdered someone, but rather than staying here where it's not safe, God is saying there's another city I've appointed for you. Possibly in the next town. But the city of refuge image is at least pointing to Jesus. This is what Jesus spoke of in chapter 7 when he's like, hey, don't cast pearls before swine. Don't spend your time on those who aren't receptive and are unbelieving and refuse. This is what we see the apostles doing, especially Paul in the book of Acts. Most of what Jesus is describing here won't even happen till after his resurrection during the early years of the church. And so he does say, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel. And you go, well, is this just a literary device? Is this just hyperbole? Is he using exaggerated language? Or is he literally saying, y'all will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes? I tend to lean toward Jesus is not being figurative here because he hasn't used much, if any, figurative language so far about what's going to happen to them. So why would he all of a sudden switch gears? Be kind of weird. There has to be some indication to determine that. But the question becomes, well, when is Jesus coming? How is he coming? Jesus will again say this in Matthew 17. After the Mount of Transfiguration, he comes down, or before that, rather, before he goes up there. And this is, I think, in reference to the end he spoke of, his disciples enduring. Like, if you endure that end, well, you'll reach the point where wrath comes upon Jerusalem and you'll be saved by obeying my words. And whatever that ending event is, it's also spoken of as the Son of Man coming. I want us to think about the end here is synonymous, or at least the same general time frame of the Son of Man coming, if not the same exact event. Then he goes on, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. And you're like, kind of weird, but these two common cultural images of a disciple or a servant or a teacher and a master, these images rather explain the logic of persecution. Like Jesus is the master and the teacher. He's going to suffer. And those who follow him, these apostles, they will willingly walk into a measure of sacrifice, suffering, and persecution as well. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher. Right? You're not above it. You can't escape these things. And the servant will be like his master. If, and here's the way that they're similar, if they've called the master of the house Beelzebul, which is what we saw in the last chapter. They accuse Jesus of, operating by demonic power when he heals a man who was mute because of a demon. He casts out a demon. And then they accuse him and say, you're just operating in the power of Beelzebul. Well, what do you think they're going to do to you guys? How much more will they malign those of his household? So it's interesting that to kind of bring this all together, Jesus uses the image of a house and his family, his household, kind of the structural thing he's put in place. But a lot of people don't know kind of the origin of Beelzebul here. So Beelzebul may have been, here's the seventh observation, may have been the name of the Canaanite god of Ekron. Many believe that miraculous feats were accomplished through this possession of a spirit. That was a common tradition or understanding or belief that, hey, when you see miraculous feats, it's probably because that person is operating in a kind of supernatural spirit, which is why the religious leaders claimed that his miracles were just kind of feats of magic performed through the agency of Satan or the prince of demons or an unclean spirit. In the New Testament era, it was believed that a man might be possessed and victimized by a demon, or might have a demon under his control if you're seeing these kinds of supernatural phenomenon around him. They appear to be accusing Jesus of practicing magic, right? As is the charge that Jesus is an imposter. And we saw the religious leaders accuse Jesus in chapter 12, or we will see them do the same thing in chapter 12. And so we'll see, them make the same accusation. And Jesus brings up houses again in chapter 12. So hold on to this image of a house and household and almost two competing empires. He brings that up again in chapter 12, where the religious leaders go, Beelzebul, talks about houses, talks about a strong man plundering another strong man's house, talks about the division of houses, and he'll reference Solomon, and a lot of that we see here in chapter 10. So here's the last observation, is God's true house. They accuse Jesus of kind of operating in the power of demons and leading a demonic house, but Jesus in no uncertain terms makes himself the master of the house here, right? If they called me the master of the house Beelzebul, and like Hebrews says, we are the house of God. Jesus, being the greater Solomon, builds a greater house as the master carpenter that he is. And Jesus has already referenced Solomon, so it's not a stretch to link Solomon and his house to this house right here. And we'll see in 2 chapters, Jesus will say something greater than Solomon is here, and he's like pointing at himself. So this household that he's referencing is the true family of God. While everyone's fighting against it, thinking we're of God, they're not. They're actually belonging to something fading that is not of God. He's not in that, and they haven't gotten with his true family through faith in the Messiah. So Jesus is letting his disciples know that as they go to houses, they're supposed to invite these people into the house of God, into the family of God through faith in Jesus. And if they refuse, then their house will be torn down, like the parable of the 2 builders. But if they accept, they'll be part of a house that cannot be torn down by the storm that's coming. In other words, they will be accepted before God. And so the question becomes, what does Jesus really mean when he says, he who endures to the end will be saved? I think either we have a general statement about what's required for a person to enter the kingdom of heaven, the enduring nature of faith. He's describing how genuine faith will last, it won't cease. Or, option number 2, Jesus is describing the people who will face real physical harm for his name in Israel. And if they last through that time of great persecution and they're alive to see the end of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, like their lives will be spared from that destruction and wrath by their faith in Jesus' words. He's warning them to flee in chapter 24. Flee Jerusalem, flee Judea, when God's wrath comes on that generation through the Roman armies. Or possibly there's a mixture of both happening here. Could be both. I'm not entirely sure. But enduring can either be the responsibility of the person, it's my job to continue believing, or it's what God allows people to go through. Like they'll endure if I decide they're going to, that being through the destruction of Jerusalem and all that, if they're going to see that. But on some level, God enables. This isn't a talk on eternal security. If you'd like my thoughts on that, that'd be a different video. But hey guys, Jason from the future here. I was watching the video back and there's just a few things that I wanted to clarify that I didn't do a good job of clarifying throughout this video. And so real quick, this is just a few things that came to mind that I really want to mention. Number 1, I know there are other passages that talk about endurance and continuing to the end and being faithful to God and all that. And this is not a topical teaching on eternal security or the nature of enduring faith. And so I know those other passages exist. I'm just not touching on them. I'm not denying them. I just don't think this specific passage in Matthew chapter 10 is necessarily talking about the same thing that we see in those passages. The other thing to note is that Jesus does not state this as a command. He doesn't say endure to the end as a responsibility on the part of someone, as a command or instruction. He just states it as a general fact. He doesn't command his disciples to do anything. He just states that those who endure to the end will be saved. So I think this is a unique idea that seems restricted to a generation of people who will see specific historical events and endure specific things Jesus has detailed in their lifetime. He's already laid these things out. I don't believe this is some statement about some future generation when Jesus is speaking directly to his apostles only and no one else. There might be some things that repeat throughout human history, persecution and signs and natural disasters and all these different things and the love of many growing cold. And we see these things repeat throughout human history that Jesus has mentioned, but that's not necessarily the point. And so I don't think you can, well, I'll say it like this. You can make those passages about endurance and continuing, you can make those say whatever you want. But I think this is still a distinctly different idea. Lastly, Jesus says those who endure through these things, likely speaking of the people alive in his generation and some of the apostles personally experiencing what he said. And if that's the case, then this statement about endurance can only be applied to the people Jesus has in mind, the people he's warning about specific events in a specific season of human history. And if that's true, then this cannot be about us. Nor can it be a general statement about all believers across time, because we're not alive to go through what Jesus is specifically describing. I might endure a version of these things, but not the specific season of human history Jesus seems to be alluding to and foreshadowing. So I don't believe that we can make this some salvific statement about all believers across time, as if Jesus is speaking of some condition or universal fact about genuine saving faith. So I just wanted to make that clear. We'll get back to the video now. Here are some passages to cross-reference with what's happening here. Matthew 24, 5 through 14. This is your homework. Matthew 24, 5 through 14. We're going to see the future Olivet discourse where Jesus talks about this same event, adding more details. Gets a little more colorful. Matthew 7, 15 through 23. We see the false prophets who are disguised as sheep. Acts 4, 1 through 13. We see Peter and John's faithful witness standing on trial. So just a few passages to consider when thinking about these things. But there's actually more I'd like to share about this passage for us to reflect on and apply to our own lives. But this video, already long enough. So what I'm going to do is post a follow-up teaching on the exclusive video section of our website for monthly supporters. And in that video, I'm going to walk through these points of transformative wisdom and application, and we'll reflect on how this profound wisdom applies to our lives today and what God is saying to each of us in this passage. So if you're a monthly supporter, thank you. I'll see you on the website in the exclusive video section. And if you'd rather just skip that teaching and download my notes from this video, those are also available to monthly supporters on our website, along with all the other sermon notes from every other teaching I've done. Just my way of saying thank you for partnering with us and helping us accomplish our mission. So in the next passage, Jesus continues preparing his apostles, but he says something pretty cryptic and hard to understand if you don't see the whole context of Matthew. He says, nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. And we go, what are you talking about? How is something hidden right now but not later? And you might be surprised by what we discover in that study. So like this video, subscribe for more Bible studies like this, and I'll see you in the next video. Hey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more biblical content just like this. We have hundreds of videos, but you might be most interested in these ones right here. Also, visit our website for all of our free resources and classes. And thank you so much for partnering with us financially to make this ministry even possible. Keep moving towards Jesus, and I'll see you in the next video.